The tourist thought he could do anything. Crossed the line, tossed a coin at the royal guardsman's feet, and even provoked a horse, confident there'd be no consequences. But when the guardsman broke his silence, the crowd froze, and his words turned the moment into an internet sensation. What did he say that left even the boldest tourist speechless? Let's start from the beginning. The morning sun cast its golden light over Buckingham Palace as the changing of the guard ceremony began. The scene was picturesque, almost sacred. Red-coated guards with their towering bearskin hats stood tall, embodying centuries of British tradition. Among them was the guardsman James Harper, whose unwavering stance and steely gaze conveyed a lifetime of discipline and pride. For James, it was just another day at his post. For the crowd of tourists, however, it was an opportunity to gawk, to laugh, and, of course, to push boundaries. "Hey mate, give us a smile," shouted a young man in a backwards baseball cap, phone in hand, filming every second. His voice, loud and grating, cut through the air like a poorly tuned violin. James didn't flinch. His expression remained as immovable as the stone lions guarding Trafalgar Square. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to get a reaction out of him, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But the tourist wasn't deterred. Encouraged by the chuckles of his companions, he took a step closer. "Oi, bro, let me try on that hat," he jeered, his hand already reaching out. "Now, pause for a second. Imagine this. Someone walking into a museum and trying to grab the crown jewels. Sounds ridiculous, right? That's exactly how this moment felt. With the grace of a fencer, James pivoted his ceremonial musket, blocking the man's hand without breaking protocol. He didn't need to say a word. His commanding presence spoke volumes. The tourist stumbled back, startled, his bravado momentarily shattered. "Oh, come on, he's just an actor," chimed in a woman from the group, tossing a coin at James's feet like she was tipping a street performer. "Lighten up, Mr. Serious." The laughter from the group grew louder, echoing off the palace gates. A few other tourists nearby joined in, snapping pictures and recording videos, their phones held high like torches at a vigil, for good taste perhaps. But not everyone was amused. To the side, a young boy clung to his mother's hand, his wide eyes fixed on James. The boy, perhaps 8 years old, appeared overwhelmed by the noise and commotion. His mother whispered reassurances, but the child couldn't tear his gaze away from the towering figure in red. To him, James wasn't just a guardsman. He was a hero, a symbol of something grand and unyielding. And then, predictably, things escalated. Another member of the group, emboldened by the spectacle, decided to make his mark. With a sly grin, he crossed the white line that separated the guards from the public, a clear breach of decorum. The crowd collectively gasped. Even those who had been laughing moments before fell silent, their attention glued to the scene unfolding before them. James remained still, but the air around him seemed to hum with tension. His grip on the musket tightened, ever so slightly, a subtle reminder that, while he was trained to endure, there were limits to his patience. And then, out of nowhere, a paper airplane, yes, a paper airplane, sailed through the air and landed at James's feet. The crowd burst into laughter once more, their previous awe forgotten. It was chaos. Tourists pushed closer, cameras clicked incessantly, and amidst it all, the boy began to cry. The noise, the intrusion, the sheer disrespect. It was all too much for him. And yet, James stood firm. But something in his eyes shifted. This wasn't just about enduring foolish tourists anymore. This was about protecting the dignity of the uniform, and perhaps more importantly, the innocence of a child who still believed in heroes. And so, for the first time that day, James moved. The crowd had barely caught its breath from the earlier spectacle when the unthinkable happened. A man in an oversized hoodie, egged on by his equally loud companions, took it upon himself to lunge toward the majestic horse stationed with another guardsman nearby. "Watch this," he shouted, waving his arms in an exaggerated motion as if he were some kind of circus ringleader. His hand darted toward the horse's muzzle, the poor animal flinching instinctively. Let's pause for a second. If your first thought was, who in their right mind would do something so absurd, you're not alone. The ripple of gasps and murmurs from the crowd echoed that exact sentiment. The horse reared slightly, its polished reins jangling as the guardsman expertly steadied it. But the disruption was enough to send some tourists backing away nervously. For all their bravado, no one wanted to be in the path of a startled horse, and that's when James Harper moved. For the first time in years of unyielding silence and stoicism, James took deliberate, measured steps forward. His musket, though still ceremonial, was held firmly, a clear signal to anyone paying attention. Enough was enough. The crowd fell silent as James approached the young boy who had been clinging to his mother's hand. The child, still visibly shaken, looked up with tearful eyes, his small frame trembling. James knelt down, his red tunic contrasting sharply against the pale gray of the pavement. "Don't be afraid," James said softly, his voice steady yet kind. "I'm here to protect you." For a moment, it felt like the world stopped spinning. The crowd, once a chaotic jumble of laughter and jeers, was now utterly still. The boy stared at James as if he had just met a knight from his favorite storybook. And then, of course, the silence was broken. "Ha! He broke character!" bellowed the same tourist who had crossed the line earlier. His voice dripped with glee, his phone angled perfectly to capture the moment. "Dude, this is going viral for sure." Cue the collective eye roll. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some casting disapproving glances at the man, others murmuring their agreement. A few had the nerve to laugh, but the sound was half-hearted at best. James stood, his imposing figure towering over the man who had spoken. Slowly, deliberately, he turned to face him, his gaze cold and unyielding. "The guard doesn't exist for your entertainment," James said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "We serve to ensure that people like you can feel safe." And just like that, the tourist's smug grin vanished. He faltered, his phone lowering slightly, as if weighed down by the weight of James's words. The crowd, however, roared to life. First, a smattering of applause, then more, until the entire square echoed with the sound of clapping and cheers. People nodded approvingly, some even shouting phrases like, "Well said," and "About time someone put them in their place." Even the woman, who had earlier tossed a coin at James's feet, looked thoroughly embarrassed. Her cheeks flushed crimson as she hid her face behind a pair of oversized sunglasses. The man filming finally pocketed his phone, avoiding eye contact with the now supportive crowd. He muttered something under his breath, but whatever it was, no one cared to listen. And in the midst of it all, the boy reached out a hand toward James, a small yet meaningful gesture of trust. James nodded subtly in return, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corners of his otherwise stoic expression. For a moment, order was restored, and though James resumed his post, the energy in the square had shifted. It was no longer just a group of tourists gawking at a ceremony. It was a lesson, a moment of reflection on respect, dignity, and the enduring power of tradition. But make no mistake, this wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the calm before the storm. By the next morning, the video was everywhere. At first, it might have seemed like just another clip of tourists trying, and failing, to provoke the stoic royal guards. But this wasn't that kind of video. It began with Guardsman James Harper standing tall, his red tunic gleaming in the sun. Then came the chaos, the disrespectful tourist lunging at the horse, the paper airplane, and the loud jeers. But the turning point, that quiet, dignified moment when James knelt down to reassure the frightened boy. Viewers around the world couldn't get enough. Social media exploded with praise, comments flooded in. This man embodies everything a true protector should be. A real-life knight in shining armor. This is why we still need tradition and honor in today's world. The hashtags #HeroInRed and #RespectTheGuard trended globally. But as the internet does, it also turned its sights on the tourist who had thrown the metaphorical first stone, or in this case, tossed the coin and tried to provoke the horse. The man's face, clearly visible in the video, became the target of collective outrage. "Who behaves like this?" one commenter fumed. "Entitlement at its worst," another agreed. Within hours, the man's social media profiles were unearthed. His posts were flooded with criticism, ranging from mild disapproval to full-blown public shaming. His attempts to defend himself only made things worse. "I was just having fun," he wrote in a now-deleted post. The response? A unanimous, "Fun isn't an excuse for disrespect." Meanwhile, James Harper remained blissfully unaware of his newfound fame. As far as he was concerned, the incident was just another day on duty. The next morning, he stood at his post, as disciplined and composed as ever. But the atmosphere at Buckingham Palace had shifted. Tourists gathered not just for the spectacle of the changing of the guard, but to catch a glimpse of the man who had become a symbol of honor and tradition. In the crowd, the young boy from the previous day stood with his mother. This time, there were no tears, just awe. As the ceremony concluded, the boy waved enthusiastically at James. What happened next would stay with the boy forever. Breaking protocol ever so slightly, James inclined his head in acknowledgement, a subtle but powerful gesture that spoke volumes. The crowd erupted into applause. It wasn't the polite clapping of tourists marking the end of a show. It was heartfelt, a collective expression of respect, not just for James, but for the values he represented. For a brief moment, the air was thick with something rare and precious. Reverence. Reverence for tradition, for discipline, and for the quiet heroism of a man who stood his ground not for himself, but for something much larger. As James adjusted his bearskin hat and resumed his post, the crowd began to disperse. Yet the impact of his actions lingered, both online and in the hearts of those who had witnessed them firsthand. And so, while the world moved on to the next viral moment, James Harper remained exactly where he had always been, a steadfast guardian of tradition, standing tall amidst the noise.